your thesis is called Neo-Idealism. If we had followed Neo-Idealism, can you give us some examples of how the Russian relationship might have looked different?
Yeah. So along the way, we had, and I mentioned some of these moments, when Ukraine first looked at independence in the early 1990s, 1990, 1991, this was a moment in which the Soviet Union looked brittle but hadn't yet collapsed. And what the US settled on was a hyper-focus, hypersensitivity on security. It was deeply fearful about what was going on in different corners of Europe, with Yugoslavia fracturing into different states and lots of civil strife, civil wars. And they were afraid that the Soviet Union might be balkanizing, but with nuclear weapons, which means that there's a risk of a nuclear proliferation and loose nukes and things of that nature. So very, very, very quickly, the US administration focused in on how do you avoid this worst case scenario in their view. And they went so far as to, when the Ukrainians were trying to puzzle out what their future might be, and they were definitely interested, they conducted an earlier referendum saying that they wanted more national autonomy. They hadn't quite decided yet that they wanted to leave the Soviet Union. Enshrined in this kind of milieu, you have George H.W. Bush come to Ukraine in July of 1991 and counsel the Ukrainians, not just behind the closed doors, but publicly, gave this infamous Chicken Kiev speech. He basically told them, chill. You've been fighting, you've been struggling for your national identity, in certain cases, for centuries. You might want it, but it's dangerous. Don't do that. And a month later, you have this putsch in which Gorbachev is arrested by hardliners, and then President Yeltsin comes in and ends up being the hero, and ultimately the Soviet Union starts to unwind. And in December of 1991, the Ukrainians hold a referendum in which 90%, just think about this, and can we get 90% of the US population to agree on things? 90% of the Ukrainian population across all territories, including Russian-speaking territories, votes to leave the Soviet Union. And that's it. That's the collapse of the Soviet Union. At that moment in time, do we take a values approach, or do we take an interest approach? We certainly weren't catering to self-determination or any of these Wilsonian values. As Ukraine establishes its own nascent state, struggling, doesn't really have a diplomatic corps, it doesn't have a defense to speak of per se. They have parts of the Soviet Union's apparatus that they're trying to gain control over. Do we take an opportunity to help the struggling Ukrainian state develop some coherence and make some investments in their transformation to a market economy? Or do we put maximum pressure on them to denuclearize? Guess what? We put maximum pressure on them to denuclearize. That was under George H.W. Bush. Clinton saw the failure of this approach relatively quickly, and there was a policy review, and they decided that you'd need both a carrot and a stick approach to get the Ukrainians to denuclearize. So it was more of a balanced approach. But again, once the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons, we lost interest. So not a values approach, always interest-driven. Let's jump forward to the next critical moment. There were plenty along the way. And let's not miss the fact that in Russia, there were massive hopes on Russia transforming into a democratic state, pan-European security. But pretty quickly you see these authoritarian, illiberal streaks appear, whether that's in the Chechen War, whether it's in violent suppression we were happy with this, a violent suppression of communist reactionaries within the Russian Federation that were looking to hold on to power or check Yeltsin's power. or the Russians making noises about Ukraine being, or Crimea being Russian territory. So there were plenty of warning signs. And then, of course, Russia's support to genocide in the Balkans, another warning sign, multiple different flashpoints. So wasn't all roses with Russia. Certainly wasn't all roses with Ukraine. Ukraine is struggling to chart its course. By the time you get to 2004, lots of data points on Russia, lots of data points on Ukraine, maybe some skepticism on both. But Ukraine makes a hard pivot. The Orange Revolution unfolds. Russia tries to buy the Ukrainian election. Ukrainian people for that first revolution protest en masse and compel a new election and select a pro-Western candidate. That seemed like a good moment to maybe invest in Ukraine. Did we? The answer is no. Why, did we condemn Russia's interference? Not really. It was tepid at best. And with regards to Ukraine, where we could have started investing in Ukraine's security and build some economic partnerships, we decided that was going to be potentially too provocative to Russia, that believed it had a privileged sphere of influence. So we didn't take the warning signs all the way through. By the time you get to just years later, you have 2008, Russia engaging in a war of aggression. It's first. The other ones were, by the way, just to be clear, there were lots of frozen conflicts that the Russians put peacekeepers in to make sure that they left regions of the former Soviet space unstable and vulnerable. But this was an outright aggression where the Russians attacked Georgia in 2008. What did we do? We slapped some limited sanctions, but about 6 months later, you have the Obama administration come in and conduct another reset, another in a pattern of let's figure out how to work with Russia. 2014, after the second revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, in which the authoritarian regime that was ruling Ukraine from 2010 on attempts to silence its population, protesting the fact that the Russians attempted to buy Ukraine, some $10 billion going to this Yanukovych character to side with Russia, to set aside their Ukrainians' European aspirations, joining the EU, pivot back hard towards Russia. So the Ukrainian people come out and protest. Yanukovych attempts to violently suppress that protest. Was that the moment that the U.S. would come in and potentially bolster Ukraine, help potentially warn off a Russian aggression? Because what does Russia do in an opportune moment? Seizes Crimea, seizes territory in eastern Ukraine. No, we didn't. This was another moment in which we looked to minimize any risks of a flashpoint with Russia, keep the door open for a more benign relationship with Russia. And this was the story all the way through. Even after the full-scale war in 2022, interacting with the White House, there were still some hopes that this would be a short-lived war and there would be an opportunity to normalize this relationship with a fellow great power. So what does Neo-Idealism counsel? Accept reality. Not realism, accept reality. Accept the fact that we've been played repeatedly over and over, catering to hopes and fears. Think about the things that really matter and focus on, and use that tool of values to help focus on what really matters. That's what Neo-Idealism counsels, a rebalance.